Just to get us started off, my name is Robin Atkinson. I'm the CEO of the Arkansas Arts and Fashion Forum, which is a nonprofit based out of Fayetteville, Arkansas. We are recording this, so you don't need to. So we will be recording this and probably editing for some content and then posting online later. So we will, if you'll send us your email address, we will send you a link to the published video in the end. How's that sound, Andrea? Okay, so anyway, CEO of Arkansas Arts and Fashion Forum, we are an organization that is focused specifically on sort of incubating arts and fashion in the state of Arkansas. You may be asking yourself, why is a fashion organization leading a question and answer session on being an ally during Black Lives Matter? And the answer to that is because we think we should. A big part of what our mission is to focus on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion within the creative landscape, specifically focusing on giving designers and creatives of color a platform and more visibility in Northwest Arkansas. Without further ado, I'll introduce our panelist. Dr. Lisa Corrigan is a professor of communications and the director of gender studies at the University of Arkansas and affiliate faculty of both African and African American studies and Latin American studies in the Fulbright College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Arkansas. Thunderous applause all around, yes. She is a feminist, rhetorical scholar who researches and teaches in the areas of social movement studies, the Black Power and Civil Rights Movement, prison studies, feminist studies, the Cold War, and the history of public address. I became aware of Dr. Corrigan during the 2016 elections on social media. She has an incredibly incisive Facebook feed that I find to be one of the better news outlets on my social media. So when we started talking about hosting this conversation, she was the first person that came to mind. So I'm really excited to have her here. I think that she's a really great source for asking questions that you may be nervous to ask in other settings. So I hope that we can get to a place where we're actually getting to the core of the problem. And yes, her Facebook feed is absolutely live. So Dr. Corrigan, do you want to tell people a little bit about the difference between your work as an academic versus your work as an activist / social media icon?
Wow, icon, that's really strong. Well, thanks for the invitation to be here. I'm thrilled to do these trainings. I've been doing them for about 10 years in Arkansas, but I have been in politics for about 25 years, since I was about 15. And so, you know, the American landscape has changed a lot, and I've spent a lot of time trying to talk to folks in the South, you know, regularly, but around the world about racial politics. And obviously I write about the Black Power movement, about civil rights politics. So I think for me, there's a social responsibility in talking to people who want to participate in larger conversations about race or want to be new activists from a perspective of somebody who's been doing the work for a really long time. And so I think everybody should feel free to ask the questions that they want answered, because I'm going to be very candid. I guess that's why you asked me here, is because I will be completely candid. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, this should be a joyful space where we understand that everybody is learning and not everybody is in the same place, but we're all moving towards the same goal.
Exactly. And, you know, one of the things that sort of inspired us to take this on was that, you know, while we've done a lot of DEI work through AAFF over the course of the last year or so, the last 2 weeks has been a particularly momentous step forward in the conversation. And not everyone that we've been working with feels quite ready to speak to that step. And so we want to provide an opportunity for people to get caught up a little bit, or to take their very first step into the conversation if that's where they are. So first step's the hardest, so let's get there. Just another housekeeping for the folks who just entered. We will be taking your questions in the chat. If you'll chat them privately to Rachel Woody Pumford, she will add them to our document, and we'll go from there. So I'm just going to start with a really easy starter question, which is, Dr. Corrigan, what do you think the sort of top rookie mistakes are when engaging in conversations as an ally for Black Lives Matter?
Here's the thing, is that it's going to be a lot of mistakes because you're not an expert in the thing yet. So I think that for a lot of people who start getting politically active, especially depending on where they are generationally, they have a lot of discomfort around failure. And so I think people make a lot of mistakes because they're trying to prevent failure and then making failure worse, and they're uncomfortable because they're not in a space where they're the expert or where they know the most or where they have the most authority. And so for white people, that can be very destabilizing to not have, you know, automatic credibility, or you know, automatically is the leader or is exempt from critique or those sorts of things. So, I mean, you know, all of the failure can be summed up in the fear of failure. And I think, you know, one of the reasons why you pitched this to me and I immediately said yes is because you're like, you know, our audience and the people we work with are a lot of white, cis-identified hetero women. And I'm like, these are all, you know, most of the white women in that group are trained to be perfectionists, right? Failure is anathema. It's a sort of small death of the self. Is anything to be avoided? You know, the thing to be avoided is failure. And so I think that it's really hard for white women to get involved in social movement activism with real deep responsibility because of the fear of failure, and that affects every other decision that they make. So there are other things that I'm going to talk about over the course, I'm sure, of the next 90 minutes that are things that they should know and that they need to know to be successful. But I mean, just like as a prima facie first thing is that you are going to make mistakes and you've got to get over the self-loathing that comes along with that. So I think the self-loathing and the fear of being wrong really prevent adequate engagement with race, period.
I think that's a fantastic answer. I feel that.
Yeah.
Very, that really speaks right to me.
Well, you know, I have a new book out called Black Feelings, and it's about race and affect in the long 60s. And really all of the racial discourse is about feelings. So when white people feel afraid, or they feel uncertain, or they feel fragile, or they feel complicit or guilty or shame, then they don't move towards action. And that's what has prevented, you know, white activists from being a really compelling part of modern civil rights activism in all of its forms, is that they can't get over their white feelings. And so those white feelings then continue to structure, you know, systematic racism and brutality in ways that people can't see. And so the feelings matter. So when you feel uncomfortable, that's a sign that something is happening. And ideally it's growth. It's not a retreat into shame.
I think that's a great starter question. I think that's a really good starter answer. So I have the first audience submitted question. This one actually came through on the Facebook event. So somebody followed the rules, which I really appreciate.
Love that.
As a person terrified of failure. So our first question is, while working through my own fragility and decentering process, what is the most productive way to encourage other white people to engage with the Black Lives Matter movement who are not saying overtly racist things, but who are also not willing to engage the topic?
I would send them links. Right? All I do is post links of stuff. If you want to know more about this, this is the starting point. If you read this, then read this. Because those people are flippable, right? There are some people that are not flippable, okay? The Klan members are not your ideal audience for like social justice activism, okay? They can't be flipped. That's not a good use of your time necessarily. You got to start with the people who are already in your crew, and they're mostly readers, right? To varying degrees, but they'll read a meme and scale that up all the way to a book. So your best way to engage them is to keep the line of communication open about things that they're curious about that are adjacent, right? So maybe they aren't necessarily curious about BLM as a movement. Maybe they like football. Well, so what do we think about Roger Goodell, right? I mean, he brought in a bunch of military brass to come yell at all of the owners of the teams that they shouldn't hire Kaepernick. So that's a place for you to connect, right, with your human who is reluctant to take a BLM stance in person or on the internet. So those people are different. They're not at different spaces. I will say that, you know, confrontation almost only works with intimates. And so intimacy is something that makes movements work. And if you can't do intimacy, you're going to be a shitty activist. And white people don't do intimacy because they're terrified of failure. And so, you know, they fall apart at every turn. So if they can't do intimacy with other white people, they're definitely not going to do intimacy with people of color, and especially Black people who they are terrified of. And especially white women who are freaked out by Black men. That is the space where the intimacy is the least likely to occur because it's been so heavily policed and surveilled and punished since the inception of the country. So, you know, start with reading, low-hanging fruit first, right? And then you can move to confrontation, you know, more confrontational postures when you have more intimacy with the people, when there's more trust, when there are shared goals, whatever. Like, there has to be more glue there for the confrontation to go. I would also say that in general, confrontation is interpersonally only really useful to stop violence as it's happening. You have to lay the groundwork for other kinds of interventions. So, you know, confrontation is not a starting point for white people, especially cis people, especially white women who don't know how to talk about race. That is not the place to start. It is never going to go well. It's only going to blow up because the entire culture is geared towards policing confrontation when women begin it, whether it's about their feelings or about their desires. Like, all confrontation that begins with white women is shut down. So that is not the most productive space, even though it's called for sometimes, especially when the consequences are very dire. Good question.
That is yes, a very good question. And there's so much to unpack in just that one question. But we won't. We'll move on to the next question.
Nonetheless.
This is why there are college courses.
Yes, I do this for a living. Many years of doing this. Many more to go.
Okay, so say that we have started the conversation. We figured out how to engage somebody who wasn't ready to engage, but they're stuck at the colorblind stage of the conversation. What rhetorical tips can you give us for moving somebody past that point?
I mean, okay, white people don't look at patterns of behavior because that's where accountability lies. So whether it's like, you know, they're just a couple of bad cops, right? They're bad apples. That is a failure to aggregate data. So if you could just do one rhetorical skill, it would be like, please produce aggregate data. Here are all the police sources. Here's how many total killings, right, of unarmed Black people. Here, you need to produce aggregate data and then talk about how aggregate data is important, because white people don't see trends, so they don't have to take any accountability, okay? So for them, like, the move from structural to personal is 100% where race dialogue just melts down for white people, right? So if we think about this as power, power has 3 levels. It has the interpersonal level. Those are the people who are in your closest level of proximity that you have interpersonal relationships with. You know their names, right? You see them around town, you work with them, they're in your family, whatever. You have a relationship. Then you've got institutional power. And those are the places where you work and do business, right, that govern you. And then there's structural power, and that's everywhere and nowhere at the same time. So white people want to locate all of the conversations about racism in a thing that they know, or a thing that they did, or a person that they saw. That is shitty politics. It's really facile. It's not scalable. It's not generally useful, right? So we need to teach white people how to read aggregate data at the structural level so that they can explain how stuff is happening, because white people don't know. And honestly, it's mystified. It's not entirely that their fault that they don't know. They're surrounded by a bunch of clanners and white supremacists who write their school curriculum and who are on their school boards and who make the laws. So like, it's disincentivized to be able to read aggregate data and make large scale arguments. So read bigger, read up, right, is a way to think about aggregate data. So I would always talk about the data first, because it's incontrovertible. And it is a skill white people do not have, right? Which is why everybody's so uncomfortable talking about race, is because it's like, where do I start? I know a person of color one time. We went to school. I have an anecdote, right? It's all anecdotal, because the other thing is that white people only knew one Black person, right? So they can be colorblind because they don't have to see people of color like ever. Like, the whole world is segregated away from that. So it's like, of course you can't see, right, longitudinal data. You know one Black person, right? And so here's your anecdote about it. So, it's very hard to be credible on race issues, especially anti-Blackness, if you don't know Black people. And I don't mean like saw them. I mean, do you have any intimate relationships with Black people or not? If not, it's gonna be harder for you to engage, right? Because the not knowing and the fear and the distance make the intimacy very hard with both the self and with the others. End rant.
If you'll just do that end rant at the end of each question.
I will. I'm like, and now I'm finished.
Scene.
Yes.
Okay, so second audience question. I think this one's really great, specifically for those of us in Arkansas. I grew up pretty segregated, and in realizing how much I have continued that segregation in my adult life. How do I desegregate my life without tokenizing Black people or going into spaces that are not for me?
You gotta let Black people choose you, okay? The people of color get to choose you because you're not safe. You don't get to choose them. That's not a thing. It's not shopping. It's not choice. That's a bad liberal meme, right? Like, oh, look, now I've exerted choice. That's how white people structure the entire world, right? Well, my choice is more important than your choice. I'm not gonna wear my face mask. Who cares if the other people get exposed, right? So choice is a terrible frame for race things. It's a terrible frame for rights generally. And so don't use that. You don't get to choose people of color to be in your circle. That's why you have to read first. So you'll be chosen to be included in communities of color when you are a credible, trustworthy ally. Otherwise, you're just a vector for death. So they're not gonna choose you because you don't even know like what you're doing, right? Which is why you're all here. And I'm sort of joking about it because it's like structural, right? It's not like you came out of the womb and you're like, you know what I'm gonna do? Anti-Blackness really hard, doing it, yes, woo, right? That's not how it is. The whole culture that you were, growing up in was designed to disincentivize you from learning about other cultures of any kind, let alone your complicity in violence. So until you become a credible actor, you're not gonna get taken up by people of color because you are dangerous to them. Like literally dangerous, like calling the police on them, right? So that's not an option. You have to let people of color choose you, and they will do that when you are an ethical actor who has already demonstrated that you have a sensibility about, violence against people of color. End.
I'll tag on to the end of that and say, so if I'm someone who doesn't have necessarily a network of people of color that I know intimately, but I would like to be getting engaged in the conversation or meeting people outside of my, immediate circle that I already know, without sort of forcing myself into any conversations, where are a couple places that I can either engage in conversation online or I can engage in conversation in person in a non-COVID world? What are a couple community areas that I can sort of wade into to meet people?
I mean, look, the thing that's happening right now is that a lot of Black voices or Indigenous voices or, voices of people from the margin who are doing justice work, they're being amplified actually. So you can go find all of the authors of all of the how to be a good ally book lists that are circulating all over the internet and just follow them. Follow them on Twitter, follow them on Facebook, read their stuff. They're everywhere. It's not, the one thing is that there's no excuse, right? Like there is tremendous access at this moment to all of the ideas that you need to be a successful and credible ally. That exists everywhere, right? But the thing is that, all experiences of people of color are not the same, even within in-groups. So, you have to read a lot to be able to be credible to talk about Black communities or Indigenous communities or Latinx communities. Like they are not homogenous. So that's labor. And it's a lifetime of labor. So if you commit to doing this, it's every day. It's every day for your whole life. There's no end point. There's no certificate of attendance. You don't get a ribbon, right? I say this to the white perfectionists. I see you. You don't get anything. You just keep doing the work. Right? And you do it because it's ethical and it's important and it's making a safer and healthier world, and that builds a better community for solidarity. So, you can look at whatever, Robin DiAngelo or Ibram Kendi or whatever. Shit, you can even listen to Brene Brown. She's talking about race now, late to the party but brought the Zima. You can read all of that stuff. There's useful stuff to find in all of that. What?
That got me. Okay, so here's another audience question, and this is a good one, I think. it's come up a lot recently, and I think not everybody's caught up quite with what the differences are. So why BIPOC versus just POC in terms of our acronym usage?
That's because of the history of chattel slavery, which is totally different with Indigenous and Black people and not all people of color. Certainly not refugees, certainly not immigrants. That's a totally different historical condition that varies across time. Whereas chattel slavery is something that defined indigeneity from the beginning of the Americas, and obviously anti-Blackness is what created enslavement as a condition of being. So that's why by POC instead of just POC, right? And that's what I'm saying. Like, you can't just be like people of color when you're really talking about anti-Blackness. So one thing that I think, you know, going back to your first question about what, you know, new folks don't know is that Black is a word you can say, right? So when you're referring to Black people, they are Black, and that's a fine thing to say, right? But all Black people are not on the same page about all the things, right? So like there's a range of opinions about whether, you know, white academics who write about Black power say should be doing trainings of white people. Some people say no, right? It should be people of color doing that. And then a bunch of the people of color are like, no, that's a bunch of emotional labor for me. Even on this one thing about who should do the speaking, there's a wide range of opinion. That's okay. That's okay. There's space for that. There's space for all of those opinions. And at every turn, you're going to have to make the most ethical decision that you can make at the time and explain to other people why you made it, right? So that's what the accountability comes into, every single one of those micro moments. But the bi part is about indigeneity and the relationship between chattel slavery and the building of the colonial empire that became the United States of America. Good question.
Quick follow-up, although I will say we're not sending questions into the group chat, but I am going to let this one fly. Can you expand on chattel? That part got hung up.
Chattel slavery is when you steal a ton of people from a place and then force them into enslavement. It's not the same as conquering, for example. So chattel slavery is the intentional stealing of humans to force them into servitude. In this case, it was the cotton oligarchy, right? So it was the cultivation of cotton that was the primary force driving chattel slavery, even though enslavement in the United States also was in the turpentine swamps, and it built the railroad, and there's a whole history of Chinese exclusion and Chinese labor that built a bunch of, you know, especially after the railroads came, right, that built all of the rest of empire. But chattel slavery is this intentional enslavement to produce goods and services, and it's permanent, right? So very few slaves bought their freedom, very few were manumitted, right? Like it's permanent, and it's your descendants are also slaves.
Okay, we'll come back around to that at the end if we have time. So this one brings the topic closer to home. And is very timely. So the next question is a statement. I'd like to suggest that everyone check out hashtag #Black@UArk for some real world accounts of what is happening here in Northwest Arkansas and the University of Arkansas. Listen to the students, consider what things we've allowed, been a part of. It's trending on Twitter. It started yesterday.
Yes.
Do you want to speak to this new hashtag at all?
Oh, I think it's great. I mean, I think it creates momentum for students and former students to pressure the administration. I think, you know, it's all of the Southern universities are they were plantations. Like they were all built on plantations. The land grant mission of higher ed is all about colonizing land from Native Americans. I mean, you know, the treatment of Black and other students of color on the U of A's campus is not as well documented as it should be, but it's fact. So I think it's great. I think that they should share their stories. I think people should listen to them. I mean, but also it's a feature and not a bug of higher education. So primarily white institutions are primarily racist. That's what they produce is whiteness, right? So they all look and act in that way, right? They all are constrained by this history of anti-Blackness in particular, but not exclusively, that shapes who they hire and where their money is spent and what their priorities are, and you know what students are admitted. It's in every level, right, from the interpersonal all the way up to the structural level of power. So I think it's great, and you should read it. And I think the call outs on the chancellor are helpful, right, because it gives him reason to push back against the state to expand a bunch of programs that have been grossly underfunded. I mean, y'all have to understand that higher ed has been excoriated, it's been crushed in funding, 50% or more at every major institution of higher learning, especially the publics, since the Bush administration. So all of those schools then have to go privately fundraise from white corporations to make up the lack of funding that hasn't existed in the last 12 years. It's been massive for higher ed. It's been a restructuring of wealth in public universities and colleges, and a real change in who's attending, you know, public education. So, you know, the chancellor is part of that, and this is going to give him political cover to make much better decisions, you know, if he's so inclined, to help build a diversity and inclusion initiatives across campus. So I think it's great. You should all go read it.
So we have a question that actually can tag onto the end of that one. I am a professor at a university. No mention of which one. How do I, under the current circumstances, make my class more attractive to diverse students, or more welcoming, maybe? Or
I mean, if you've been in higher ed for a minute, you know the word gets out about who you are, right? So if your value is to showcase, right, discourses about or by people of color, then that has to be built into the rubric of your syllabus, into your biography, into your research agenda, into your service life at the department. That's not just like a one-off, I taught a class that included the word Black, right, or something. So you have to decolonize your syllabus, and if you just Google decolonize syllabus, there are gazillions of examples for how to think about syllabus writing as just one intervention where you can make a difference in thinking about curriculum differently. But the curriculum is all white. It always has been, right? It's how we police who gets to be in the classroom and who's producing excellence and who is producing rigorous scholarship. And so one thing is to assign people of color as experts, because I will tell you right now that in your predominantly white institution, if that's where you're at, your white students have no idea that Black people and other people of color can be experts on anything other than their individual lived experience. So showcase them as experts, right? And give them assignments that help them produce a more equitable, just society. Those are the things, like just from a classroom perspective, that I think are essential. Also, you need to learn their names and pronounce them correctly. That's just like human, right? Like base humanity, call people the names, right? Call them by their pronouns, right, that they prefer, and call them by their names. Otherwise, you're just dehumanizing your students, and that's absolutely wrong and unethical.
Very simple, sort of simple steps there at the end. It's the little things, right, that can create a sort of more welcoming environment. I think that's really, that should speak to any of the professors that are on here.
The other thing is, too, you're going to have hostile white kids. Like PWIs are full of them, right? So you have to call those out. If you have the social power in the room to call out the white kids who are being abusive, inside or outside the classroom, you 100% have a social responsibility to handle that. You are the person with the social power, right? If you're a white instructor and you've got abusive white kids, you've got to shut that down. So don't let that fly. That's a hostile work environment, right? And it's actionable and it's wrong. So I would say also that.
Okay, so moving on to the next audience question. If we want to engage at a local level, are city councils a good place to go? And if so, what would you suggest to make the topic effective? I would like to advocate for halting the funding of the new police station, and I know that it is controversial among some.
Okay, so now we're in Fayetteville proper, and I do know that there are a lot of people who are, I see you all, right? So I know a bunch of you are not living in Fayetteville. But so yes, city councils are a good place to advocate. So what you need to do is, there are two steps to being an effective activist, okay? One is to create effective political pressure, okay? And that's to push somebody toward a thing that you want, right? That's a hammer or a fist. you want to push them. So that starts with private pressure. Those are emails to your city council member or legislative representative, whatever, right? That happens behind closed doors, private, right? Those are private closed door meetings. Those are private connections. And then they scale all the way up to public pressure, right? Which is a demonstration or a march or a riot or whatever, right? So you have to create pressure to get social change. You also have to create cover, right? So in the case of the chancellor at the U of A, he needs a bunch of public outcry about race issues at the U of A to get more money to do race things, right? So there has to be cover from him from the outside where he can go and ask for things from people who don't want to give him the things. So you have to create a way to cover the people so that they can make, the elected officials, so that they can make unpopular decisions or decisions that are going to have negative consequences from them. Does that make sense? So to be an effective activist, you have to do pressure and cover at the same time. And so depending on the thing, in the case of the police station, that's actually a county-wide issue. That's not a city issue. It's not a municipal building. It has county funding. So if you want to weigh in on that issue, you have to read everything about the way that that new building came to be, the way that its bond was financed, the way that the conversations happened around that, so that you can be conversant with the people who have already invested their energy into the thing. Anybody who wants to work on that at the moment is late to the party. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't. It just means that you have to catch up with a bunch of layers of pressure and cover that have already happened, right? Some of them may be relevant, some of them may not be. But I think the municipal places are really good places for new activists to push. Also right now, happening concurrently with this chat, is our city council's meeting to think about requiring masks in all public spaces and in all, I don't know, I guess restaurants and, public-private spaces. And so that's a thing you could just reply all to all of the members of the city council. I'm in ward, whatever. I think that wearing a mask is good for public health. It has disparate effects on people of color to not wear masks because they have disparate access to healthcare and healthcare coverage and hospitals. And then that's a thing. That's a thing you could do right now. That would be extremely helpful if you think that wearing a mask in public is something that the city should take a stand on. And it has actual real life consequences for people of color that are 100% disproportionate to white people. You could do that, and it's a good thing to do. So yes, I think city governments are a good place to plug in. But I also think that new activists need to understand that there are layers, right? So you have your municipal politics and what's happening in your city, you have your state level politics, and you have the federal politics, and those are different. And they don't match up. Especially in Arkansas, the things that are happening in our state really have nothing to do with the federal level of government. They exist almost exclusively in two different worlds. So in order to think about politics, and being a good activist, you need to have a stronger sense of politics more generally, read more generally, think about larger circles of politics to help inform the kind of decision that you're going to make about where to put your energy.
Based on the tremendous access to resources that you mentioned, all of the reading lists and podcasts and books and movies, is sharing those at this point still useful as an act of allyship, or are there other things that we should be doing?
Oh yeah, there's tons of stuff you should be doing. So if we think about those levels of power, right, interpersonal, institutional, and structural, those are all three different huge pots to move within. Right? So personally, you need to be reading all the stuff and watching it and supporting it and, right, amplifying voices of color around issues that you care about. That's a thing you can do, right? But if you scale up towards the structural, then there are all sorts of things. So I think for the purposes of this conversation, I'm just going to choose one out to talk about as like a buzzword to think about in your brain, because I know that it will bounce around later when we're not on the internet together. And that is divestment. Okay, so when we think about segregated cultures where colonialism has stripped a shitload of resources from people of color to the hands of the wealthy white people, we have to think about that as an apartheid structure, right? That is fundamentally insulating the upper class of white people from any accountability and from the redistribution of wealth back downwards, right? So it's socializing the risk, say, of not wearing masks, right, with a massive global pandemic that's totally not well understood, and then reaping and keeping all of the rewards, right? So all of the risk gets shut down to the bottom. It's pushed down on the weakest members of the culture, and all of the rewards then are at the top. So white people need to think about divestment as an ethical strategy of engaging white supremacy, right? That means give up your resources, right? Your time, your energy, your cash money, your knowledge about an institution, right? So, you know, I often act as a clearinghouse for like that kind of structural knowledge. So people will come to me and be like, I want to know the lay of the land about X, Y, or Z, right? And then I just brain dump all of the information. How to, you know, I do stuff about how to argue for raises and how to leverage power in state government and whatever, all of those things. That's a resource that I have that's renewable that I can give away a lot, which is why we're here doing this thing together, right? So you have to divest your resources. Spend money at Black businesses. Do you not know any Black businesses? Ask. That's the thing that everybody will give you honest feedback about. Oh, you should buy at this place. You should shop here. For these things, go here. I shared a thing the other day about Black-owned bookstores in the United States. Have them ship you your books. Don't buy from Amazon, right? So boycott and divestment go together. And so we boycott the bad people who do the racist things. Home Depot, I'm looking at you. And that Wendy's, I'm looking at you. Ray Kroc and McDonald's, I'm looking at you. And then we spend our money in ethical places, places that support the things that we believe in. Right? So that means reorganizing all of your purchasing behaviors, all of your consumer behaviors have to be reorganized. That's a thing that you can do that is extremely ethical and thoughtful, that if you talk about in any room of people of color, they're going to be like, yes, more of that. That is a thing that you will get positive feedback about. Like, I am thinking very productively about divesting my money and resources in these ways. And you don't have to be rich to do that, right? I assume that the call for social justice is not full of billionaires, even though I live in billionaire land, right? That's not who's on the call. So that scales based on what kind of money you have. And also, you know, you need to think differently about your money and how you spend it and how you make it and how you leverage it. So divestment is a thing that I want everybody to think about in terms of their own accountability and what they should be doing with their money and time and resources.
When it comes to focusing on fixing white people instead of helping Black communities, what skills do we need to fight white people?
That's a good question, because really the Black people and people of color don't want your leadership, okay? They don't want that, ever, not necessary, okay? But they do want you. Stokely Carmichael has this great quote in his Black Power speech at Berkeley, where he's like, you know what, white people, you need to civilize yourselves. Like, we already know we have human rights, but you need to go and civilize yourselves. And that's really the thing. Right, so that at the interpersonal level is the books and the reading and the sharing of the reading lists and the talking to other white people, which we're doing, right? And then the institutional is supporting and amplifying Black agendas and the voices of people of color and rectifying exploitation and mentoring students and expanding opportunities and hiring and retention, right? And then at the structural level, then it's like, okay, well, so that power is everywhere all the time. So how do we think about white people? So that's like, you know, saying something when you're in line at the grocery store and somebody makes a racist comment, right? That is the day-to-day call out, right? That these are not acceptable things. That is managing your family and the trash behavior that they have. We all know that they have it, right? So that's managing that in a whole host of ways. I like to think about it as like the gross uncle phenomenon. Right? It's like, what do we do with everybody's gross uncles that are super racist and they say all this stuff at the holidays and they get, you know, right? And they're terrible. So it's like, how do you manage your own humans and your affective, intimate connections with other white people? And you know, there are cases when you should 100% withhold your labor, emotional, sexual, intellectual, and otherwise from trash white people. Don't put, you know, don't give them your labor, withhold your labor, boycott the bad white people, right? Financially, emotionally, socially, sexually. So, you know, and it also goes back to that first two questions. It's like, okay, you got to scale up. The flippable ones, you got to go and get those first because they're the low-hanging fruit. They're the easiest to practice on, right? Are they just uninformed, or are they possible Klan recruits, right? If they're curious, that's where you start. Anybody who's curious, you know, you need to be generous about. Like, you're curious, I'm curious, let's talk about this. So I think for white people, it's very hard to be emotionally generous because their emotional lives are very, very austere. And that's why they're so repressed quite frankly. So it's like being generous and thinking about abundance is not something that white people do. White people think entirely in terms of scarcity. They're hoarders. That's why you've got 1,000 TV shows about shit that they hoard and stuff that they don't need. They buy giant houses full of shit. I mean, if you look at the housing sizes since 1950, they've doubled in square footage, and it's all almost entirely in attic and closets, storing shit that they don't need. They're hoarders. And that's how they are emotionally and financially and sexually, and so they're all repressed. So it takes a lot, I think, for white people to be emotionally generous with themselves and with other people, and to do forgiveness and generosity, even while like the political climate is rage and demanding change. So there's a disconnect there that white people can't manage because their emotional lives have a lot of, they're just very austere, right? They don't have spaces where they can express big feelings, and if they do, then it's mostly white nationalism. So for the middle class-ish, you know, and poor white people, there's just like not space for them to feel shit, so it makes it hard for them to collaborate with other people. The end. I want to talk about that one though forever, just like all day long.
I'm nodding so hard over here. I feel like I'm going to fall out of my chair. Yeah, I've never heard anybody
it's fine.
Refer to white people as emotional hoarders, but yes, correct. That rings very true. Actually, I have.
Can I say one more thing about that? White people think about feelings like banking, right? It's all transactional to them. And so they're like, I want to know that if I do X, I'm going to get an immediate payout, because they also want immediate gratification, because they have terrible emotional, like, regulatory systems. They don't co-regulate with other people, right? They can't manage their big feelings. And so they are all anxious. And so they're like, if I plug in X, will I get Y immediately? And so it's very hard to train white people to act in social movements, because like that shit takes time, like a lot of time, like generations and stuff, right? And so they're like, but I want the immediate gratification right now. And it's like, that's not really how politics works. Anyway, sorry.
No, I think that's fantastic.
What's more to say, Robin?
So I'm going to tag on to that with something I've seen, and this is a question that I have. So I have a lot of friends, and myself as well. I'm sort of going through this at times. There's a lot of trauma that needs to be processed when learning about all of the ways that we've engaged structural racism over the course of 400 years in the United States. It's not our trauma necessarily, but it's trauma that has to get processed. And so a lot of people who have not begun that journey, or who are just beginning that journey, and feeling that really sort of raging emotional load that comes with unpacking all of that information, how do you recommend that we process those emotions without burdening any of our Black friends or any of our friends from diverse communities, or how do we sit and process that in a way that's not selfish?
Okay, so this is the thing, right? White people are super selfish. And so they can't see when self-care becomes solidarity, because they don't do solidarity. So might I recommend getting a journal? Also a therapist, ideally both at the same time. Also mental health crisis in America. So, okay. But I mean, I did hear the Blue Cross Blue Shield like basically said that nobody had to copay during the COVID, which is great. Also, you should lobby your insurance companies to like disappear so that people can have health care. But anyway, so I would say get a therapist for sure to talk it through, because you're paying that person to do that labor, and ideally that's how that should go. And then you need to get a journal, and you need to write about your feelings. Like, I don't know, I almost want to drop, I talk a lot about feelings wheels. I might drop one into the chat. But so if you Google feelings wheels, you can look at these arrays of all of these rich words to describe our feelings. And like white people use 4 of them. I am mad, I am sad, I am glad. I mean, it's like a Dr. Seuss book. That's why they love that shit. So anyway, you need better emotional language to describe your feelings, because what white people are feeling is very rarely trauma as it pertains to race. It's often pain, it's guilt, sometimes it's shame, but it's not trauma, right? That is reserved for different kinds of events and, circumstances and structural problems. So white people need to work through guilt and shame, because if you can't get past those things, you can't be a credible ally. Nobody's going to trust you if every time they try and talk about stuff, then you wipe tears at them, right? Because you have no emotional regulation of your feelings. So, you know, white people are contained, they're repressed, so they think that they're holding it together even though they're so anxious, they're vibrating and they can't manage it. But that's not, that's just bottling it in. That's not a productive transformation of feelings into action. And justice movements, justice generally, but movements need you to transition from feeling like shit to doing a thing. And it's in between that the journal can help you work through your feelings and do the intimacy with yourself that you need to be a credible, ethical actor. If you don't know what you're feeling, nobody will trust you, especially people who are dying at the hands of the state that supports all of your repression as a white person. So you have to transition from feeling to action. The only way to do that is intimacy with the self.
I think that's a great answer. Yeah, moving on to the next question. What is the balance between learning about Black communities and also learning about the oppressors, learning about what is wrong with white families, schools, and churches?
I mean, I do both. Permute, do both. That's a joke for Kate. I see her over there with her beach scene. Yeah, you got to do both of those things, right? So you have to understand what the features of oppression are and how they are articulated, you know, through language and policy and action. And you also have to understand what resistances look like and understand why it's credible and useful, right? So like white people are sad about riots and they're sad because they're afraid, but that's just because they've never been able to tap into their rage. White ladies don't get to rage unless they're calling the cops on Black people. So generally, rage is not an experience that white women can articulate as something that they can have solidarity with because they don't do it. They have no experience with it, especially as adult people. Now they might eat their rage, right? I mean that metaphorically and also factually, right? They may, they may church their rage, they may read their rage, but they don't get to express it. And so, you know, in order to be a solid ally, you have to have both sides of the equation. You have to understand the historical, you know, things that have happened to get us here. And like I said, that's not a thing that's going to come after reading one book, right? That's a lifelong re-education, and it's a commitment to an ethical kind of future that should be a part of your everyday praxis, right? It should be part of every day that you live. You're like, you know, white supremacy is really bad for everybody, and we're not doing that, right? So you have to learn both sides. I don't think that there's like, I don't know, there's no like golden ratio about that. Just do both.
I'm afraid to be too vocal online about Black Lives Matter because of my professional standing. What advice can you give me about how to be publicly supportive in a fraught professional state?
Okay, so this is going to come out as kind of caustic, and I mean it that way. And it's to get better friends. Okay, so when you move up in rank, that means that there are more people that are intentionally excluded from power that are not going to create solidarity. So that means that the higher you are up into the structural power, the more that you are hoarding power from other people. So that's an accountability question. And it's also a question of get better friends. So if you can't do solidarity work at work, but you need to keep that job or want to keep that job, then that means that you have to have more radical friends than the people that you work with, right? Because the people at your institution, they exist to perpetuate the institution. They do not exist to do anything other than perpetuate the institution, okay? That's what they're doing. So they are trending towards stasis all the time. They're not trending towards change. They don't want abrupt change. They don't want to do hard things. Like none of that shit is on the agenda whatsoever. So you can't expect it of them because the institution exists to perpetuate itself exclusively. That is not, you know, you can slowly build solidarity, right, by bringing in people who share those ideas. But if they don't exist there right now, that's a long-term project. Otherwise, you got to get better friends. And so reading groups are good for that. Book clubs are good for that. You know, the political clubs are good for that. Issue-specific political clubs are good for that. But you have to go find the people who are doing the thing that you want to do, right? You have to find the people who are already being the kind of person that you want to be. Otherwise, how else do you model, right? And they exist, you just don't know them necessarily. But they exist and they're on the internet. I mean, that's how we found each other, right? They're all over the internet. So that's a good space. And the internet is a good place to practice. Twitter in particular, you can argue with all kinds of strangers that have no political fallout to your life. So it's a good training ground. And it creates thick skin, which quite frankly, white people need. That would be my recommendation.
Get a Twitter.
Get on Twitter.
Your boss is not on Twitter.
No. But his are. All of his bosses follow all over the internet. Some of them are here. I see you all. So don't think that just because they're not following you that they don't know. They know.
They know.
They
know. Okay. Can you speak about white people as cultural products? What we need to know about how we are made and what interventions we need to make better white people? What do we need to do to create better? You got to raise better white people. So I assume that there are a bunch of parents here on the line. Okay, so that's serious shit, raising kids. What have you done to create a different sensibility in your children so that they're not little racists? Do you read books featuring and about experiences of people of color, right? Because I'll tell you what, your public schools are not doing that work because they're run by the same white people that are structuring power away from people of color, right? So they have a vested interest in not doing that work. That means you have to do supplemental work. Charter schools are worse because they have no oversight or accountability to boards of directors or the state or federal governments. They don't have to turn over any of their stuff. So, you have to intervene there to produce better little white people, if that's what you're doing, right? You have to do the work to make sure that they have experiences. So maybe that means that instead of going to the country club all summer, you choose 10 museums and go do cultural lessons. Oh, is that more work for you? Correct. That is the thing, right? Is more work to be a better person who's doing anti-racist work. And so you have to commit to that if that's the goal. If not, then it's bullshit, and you don't have the will to do the thing, and be honest about that. But if you want to do the thing, then you have to intervene in the appropriate spaces, whether it's, I'm giving that as an example because we haven't really talked about the nuclear family as a space of white supremacy, but we could, Robin, we very well could. I could definitely discourse on that as well. So the family, the nuclear family, the heterosexual family is 100% the building block of white supremacy in America, and it's mostly controlled through straw man arguments about sad white women, right, being raped by black men. So the white family is a bad space for solidarity. And we know that because it's a lot of chicks on this call who I know personally identify as cis and hetero. And so I see y'all here solo without your partners. Where are they? What are they doing? I'm just saying they're not in the call. So, and I would say that that's the case with social movements with the white people, that when the white ladies get pissed off or upset, they go it solo without their partners. That tells you a lot about how heterosexism works in tandem with white supremacy to oppress people of color. And it also tells you that white women are afraid to step out of that because they get policed at home by the daddies, their fathers, and their husbands. So, heterosexuality is a sad space for white supremacy. And that's a place that I think all the folks need to be thinking about because I see you all here solo. As a white woman whose heterosexual husband is in the room with the kid,
that's okay.
I will give him credit for the fact that he's taking care of the 5-month-old. I hear airplane noises. So positive things are happening. It's not.
But that's good. Listen, Robin, childcare is radical. We should have it. It should be federally funded. I mean, yes. And also privatizing the family inside of the home fundamentally and disproportionately affects you as the mother person in that household. And also I'm telling you this because you made yourself the example and it served my purpose. I'm sorry, but you're welcome.
No, it's, childcare is totally radical. We could go into that. Maybe that's a different Zoom call together.
That's a different Zoom call, but I'm here for that.
We'll put that one on the calendar. Yeah. Okay, next question. What would you say to white savior mentors who come into our neighborhood under auspices of an organization like a ministry that always centers its whiteness and boasts about the good that it does?
Yeah, the civilizationists are bad news. That's always racist. Like, there's no way around that. So, so I have a podcast called Lean Back, and we just with my co-host Laura Wiederhoft, and we just recorded an episode that we dropped yesterday on despair. And I had to apologize to her at the end of it because I just lost my shit for about 30 minutes talking about the photographs from the marches happening around America. And some of them are vigils and some of them are, I don't know, not marches, and they're not protests, but the white people feel really good about showing up. And you should feel good for showing up, right? Like, so show up, that's one thing that one can do sometimes. But on the other hand, it's all these pictures of white folks selfieing with like all these black folks in the background, like they're on a mission trip. And it's super, we have a term for that. It's racial tourism, right? Lisa Nakamura writes about racial tourism and the way that white people play video games online and assume avatars of people of color as a way of exploring, right, other cultures, but also as a way of being a tourist without actually having to take any of the physical violence or consequences of that. And so, I think that if you go to events, right, that are, let's say, BLM centered or whatever, you cannot be a racial tourist. It's fucking weird to take the pictures of the black people. Do not do it. It's wrong. It's wrong. It's exploitative. It is about proximity to blackness. It's about proximity to cool. It's extremely racist. So document police abuse, please. By all means, turn on your camera, right, when the cops are beating people. But do not take the pictures of you at the protest like you're the hero, or even if it feels like the most momentous, like, radical thing you've ever done, and I'm here for that feeling and you should celebrate it, don't put it on the internet like that. It is tourism. And so I say that knowing that a bunch of y'all have done that. And I am not judgmental about you personally for doing it. It is the way that the thing is being mediated at the moment. But I'm telling you right now that if I am a person of color who wants to radicalize you and I see a bunch of your missionary pictures at the protest or vigil or whatever with a bunch of black folks in the background and you're there with your white posse, that is a no, right? So you are already limiting yourself outside of the spaces that you purport to want to be a part of. So it's much easier to do the racial tourism, to invest in black communities, and to do the racial tourism is obviously white supremacy.
I have a question to follow up on that, which is with the demonstrations that are happening in the area, whether they are marches properly or vigils, or I won't use any derogatory terms. What is a way that a white ally can get involved that is not centering, but that may be sort of supportive logistically? Or like,
yes. Listen, movements are not ashamed to ask for stuff because they are trying to do an instrumental thing. They want to do the X at the Y. They want the A to turn into the B. It's instrumental. It's an if-then causal thing. So if they need a thing to make a thing happen, they're going to ask. You don't have to make it up in your head. It's not like a thought experiment where it's like, guess what the black people are thinking that they need? They know. They know. They need money. They need humans. They need you to be a sign holder. Many of you are excellent sign holders. That's a skill set that is necessary. It is essential in creating either cover or pressure. Know that you're a sign holder and that's where you are at. Do that, okay? But it's not like you have to invent it. The movements have leaders. You are not the leaders. So you don't have to do all of this like hand wringing, right? They will say, send money to the bail fund. They will say, we need people at the city council meeting. They will say, call and write your representative. It doesn't need to be as mystified and as, I don't know, hand-wringing as the white people want to make it out to be. The white people hand-wring because they don't want to do the thing. They don't want to give the money. They don't want to show up in person and be actually too close in proximity to the radical thing, whatever. But the hand-wringing is about them not wanting to actually execute what is being asked. So when you feel that way, when you feel anxious about blackness or about people of color, that's you being like, I am not willing to do the thing necessary to change. That's an accountability thing for white people.
I think that's a really good, I would like to just repeat that back almost, that anxious moment that comes is the moment that you should clue in on. Like, what's causing that anxiety in that moment? Don't get anxious and then sort of run away from the anxiety. That's the growth moment, right?
Okay, but so like if we could just dip very, very briefly into cognitive psychology, right? If the attachment theorists are right, if Bowlby and the others are right, then what, 60%, that's generous, of us are securely attached people, right? And the other 40% is split between anxious and avoidant, right? And with white people who are anxious or avoidant are hard to bring into social movements because they cannot emotionally regulate with other white people, let alone with the people that create fear in them. So they make difficult allies, which is why I'm saying like journaling and doing counseling is really important, because if you're emotionally avoidant, you are not going to be in the consciousness raising session, right? Because the thing is to get the feelings out and to process them. And if you are anxious, then your anxiety is going to make you neurotic so that you cannot participate in an authentic way. And you're going to constantly be trying to get away from, right, the actual task at hand. And so anxiety is you know, it is an intentional product of white supremacy. So when you, and also heterosexism and also ableism and all of those things too, even though that's not the focus of this talk, right? So when you feel anxious, that's one thing. I mean, you know, I don't know. It also, things take practice. They take practice to do. So you have to find spaces where you can continue to practice. Otherwise, you're not going to get good at them. Right? And so that's a responsibility that white people have, to both create and maintain spaces where folks can practice their skills to emotionally regulate so that they can be competent social actors in movements that are full of diverse personalities, and folks that are both a product of trauma and also experiencing it in the moment. So if you are not around people who have experienced trauma or are about to experience trauma at a protest or a march or an action, you probably don't have any business being there. Right? Because you have no business supporting people who have lived through that trauma and who are about to live through trauma unless you're about to go through it with them. Right? And even then, white people prefer to trauma bond rather than authentically feel the feelings, and that's problematic too. So like really what I'm saying is that you all need to read a lot more about who you are and how you feel, right, to understand how politics works. Because if you can't see how you're being asked to feel, and if you can't process your feelings in the moment, it's very, very hard to be present for things that demand your total attention, you know, like a protest or a march or something else. Anyway.
I think that's incredibly valuable information. So we'll move on from that one. I've been asking places that have yet to make statements about their stance on Black Lives Matter, and have walked out the door / canceled contracts if I hear all lives matter in response.
That's good.
At Black-owned NWA lists local to Northwest Arkansas Black businesses. Okay, so that's just a statement. Do you want to speak to that relationships that we have with organizations that may not have made their stance clear yet?
I mean, look, you asked about me to come here and talk about performative allyship a little bit, you know, when we talked on the phone, and like the statement that we support BLM and that we're anti-racist is like the most performative allyship possible, right? It's like, okay, you support BLM, let me see a picture of your board of directors, please. I would like a photograph of that. Who works here? Who's in charge, right? Where are the tokens? Where are the all white staff and faculty or whatever? Like, you know, that it's not that the symbolic is not important. It's that the symbolic is only important if it leads to something beyond the representation, right? So like movies about a thing are important, right? Because they communicate information, but they're only as important as if they lead to action. Do you see what I'm saying? So like, there's a history of this, right? Where social movements in the 1960s, especially civil rights and Black power, were trying to produce a different kind of economy of power, right? That was financial and political at the same time. And then they all got killed and assassinated. I write about this at length in a couple of the books that I've written. And because they were assassinated, then all of the leaders were gone. And so the 80s and 90s are all about cultural production of Blackness. So you get a bunch of film and you get hip hop and you get other things. Symbolic is important. It's just only as important as it leads to concrete action that changes what power looks like. So I think that it's good to boycott contracts with the All Lives Matter people, for sure. I think boycotting is obviously a part of the apartheid structure and thinking about divestment. And I also think that there's limited utility in the statements from organizations and entities if they don't lead to structural action. You know, I work in higher ed, so I'm like, okay, I like the D&I initiatives, but can you just hire more people of color and pay them and to retain them? Because if you're not, the rest of this is just window dressing bullshit, right? And that is about managing white egos and not actually producing equitable institutions. So let's be honest about that. And if we're not really going to hire and promote and retain, you know, talented people of color, which exist everywhere, then the rest of it is bullshit. And the other thing is that white people convince themselves that it's scarce, right? That there aren't very many people of color who could do X. That is like the mental gymnastics of white supremacy about scarcity are huge. I mean, they just convince themselves that nobody could possibly do this amazing thing that they're totally mediocre at, right? But they don't know Black people, so they don't know. But they just assert it like it's true. So anyway, kudos to you for boycotting the All Lives Matter thing. That's important.
I want to ask about, and we talked about this a little bit before, you know, now that we're past that moment where everybody had to make their statement and everybody used the black tile, and everybody made their stance clear, what can we do to ensure that not only are we staying true to what we may have posted during that moment, but holding accountable these brands or these companies or these institutions to the statements that they made? Like, what are our next 4 moves or 1 move?
I mean, if us as white people, and I assume it is, then white people need to practice divestment, right? So stop giving money to corporations that are producing the society that you hate. Like, it doesn't need to be Stockholm Syndrome. You don't need to be held hostage, but these assholes, quit them. Get out of the abusive relationship with capital. Get the fuck out. Go, right? You need to do that. And if the we is a larger we, which on the whole, I think probably white people shouldn't include themselves in, then the movement is going to go where the movement is going to go. There's already inertia there, right? So it's going to go towards divestment of the police. It's going to go towards, you know, rebuilding social institutions that do equity work, whether it's social work or public education, but the public institutions whose mission is to democratize information and access. So go, you know, like, go join your voting rights organization. Join the League of Women Voters. They're doing all of the redistricting work that's going to change what representation is going to look like in Arkansas for the next 10 years. It's probably the single most important thing that's happening in your state. And the League of Women Voters is like this unsexy 100-year-old entity that's been trying to expand voting rights. And it's mostly white women in Arkansas. That's a safe place that you can go and learn about political shit and also register people to vote. And you should do that. It's low-hanging fruit. It's easy. You'll learn from it. Do that thing. But in terms of BLM, that agenda is set and you are not a part of it, and it's not important for you to have an opinion about what should happen next as a strategy or tactic. That is not where your energy should go. That ship has sailed. It is moving on whether you're there or not. So it's not essential for you to participate as a white person in that level of tactics and strategy. You're not there yet. Nobody on, that's why you're on the call, is because you're like, I don't know what's even happening there. Right. So you are not the driver. And so I think that that's the hard thing for white people, is like, I don't know where the train is going. Correct. Yeah. Not the decider. You are not the decider. You're not the expert. Stand down and find places to plug in that make the most sense, given your skills and your network and where you exist. Another thing is, I think white people don't know in politics is that, you know, political changes, policy changes in particular, happen because people map out networks. So if you are curious about influence and power and how it works, you should read a bunch about power mapping. What is your network? Who's in your network? Who do they know? Who are they trying to influence? Who can be influenced? Where is the intimacy in that network where you can influence people one way or another? And I think people outside of politics don't know that that's how it works, but it is. That's how you figure out how to leverage pressure and cover at the same time.
I'm going to take one from the public chat because you mentioned it. A lot of people don't understand the difference between equality and equity. Can you explain a little bit the difference between those 2 words?
Equity is about parity. So it's 1 for 1, right? So if you make $140,000 at your job in your body, then any person in that job should also make $140,000. Equality is that everybody has the opportunity to make $140,000, right? Does that make sense? That equity is parity in the same space, right? So it's a 1 for 1. So it's like, if you get this, I get this. It's tit for tat. And equality is that everybody has the opportunity to do that thing, right? if you look at just the wealth gap between Black America and white America, or goodness knows, Indigenous America and white America, the household wealth accrued over the course of one family is so massive, it's like 100,000 times difference in terms of just aggregate wealth. So there is no, while there might be equity, right, in a job that has a candidate of color and a white candidate, that does not mean that there's equality for all the people to be that thing, right? Like, I grew up in Ohio as a first-generation college kid. I was never going to be president. So that is a lie, right? Because there is not, we don't all have the equality of opportunity. We barely even have equity within, you know, a similar institution, a similar situation based on the bodies that are there. Is that helpful? Hopefully. Robin, that makes sense?
Yes, that makes sense to me.
Okay.
Can you explain to us a little bit about what a microaggression is, and then tell us some that we may need to be aware of to avoid?
Do not touch people's hair, ever. There's no reason for you to touch anybody without consent, ever. There's no reason. You shouldn't be hugging unless it's consensual, right? Like, don't do that. That's a microaggression. Saying anything about anybody's hair is a microaggression. Saying anything about anybody's body at all in general. You lost weight. I like that dress on you. That is all microaggression. Mispronouncing names, refusing to use pronouns. Anything, almost everything about rigor and merit is microaggression. Like, I don't know that you really brought your A game today is a microaggression, right? If it's about race. What else would I say are good microaggressions that are very common examples? I don't know. Qualifications are often microaggressions, right? So almost all of the discussion about qualifications as they pertain to merit are full of microaggressions. I don't know that that person would be a right fit. I don't know that they would fit in the office culture. I don't know that their personality really gels well with what we're doing here. I think that they would be lonely if they took this job in this predominantly white space. Like, where would they have, all of that stuff is about accommodating whiteness in white spaces, and it's about delimiting the people of color that white people come into contact with, because white people do not know how to be intimate with people of color. And, you know, and when white people don't know, and when they encounter things that they don't understand, they become aggressive. And microaggressions happen all the time, but there's also like aggressive aggressions, right? So I'm glad that people are like aware that microaggressions are happening now, and they can spot them, and they're thinking about them. And you can Google list of microaggressions and read about that very easily. Everybody on the call has the opportunity to do that. But also macroaggressions are what structures the economy. Right? So that's housing policy and segregation and funding for public education and the absence of universal health care. All of those things are macroaggressions that create inequalities that are structural and are violent. Right? So we want to think about microaggressions. They're important. We also want to think about what their relationship is to macroaggression and to structural violence.
Let's see. Okay, so we've got one more comment that has been turned in. If anybody has questions, get them in now. We're going to take the last chunk, and then we're going to wrap it up. So this one is from somebody who was in the that chatted to Rachel. Are broad generalizations about the negative characteristics of white people supposed to be something that white allies identify with? Because I don't. Racists have done the same about Blacks and other races, and I find that dehumanizing in the same way. I get systemic racism, and I am not being a fragile white lady, but I object to broad generalizations about any groups of people.
Oh,
Why is that necessary to make the case for allyship?
Well, because, I mean, I don't know if this person was here at the beginning of the talk when I was talking about aggregate data, but this is why aggregate data is important, because we can point to people and say, okay, here is the data about how cops abuse unarmed Black people. They are, as a class of people, created to police Blackness, to keep people of color, but especially Black people, away from wealthy, you know, waspy white people. There is a history of that. I wrote a book about it, and it's called Prison Power. You're welcome to read it, right? But those There's data that backs that stuff up. So generalizations are only helpful if they aggregate data. Otherwise, then they're trash arguments. So sure, you can object to arguments that are not based in data, but arguments about how whiteness operates as a structure and as a discourse are not, I mean, they're only arguable insofar as you can marshal different evidence that disproves it. That's not anecdotal, right? Because the anecdote is where, remember, white people go to avoid accountability. Well, I saw one thing one time, right? Which may or may not be true. Like, I don't care what you saw or think you saw, right? This is, if we stick with the crime scene, that's what white eyewitness accounts do, right? Eyewitness accounts are the least credible evidence at a crime scene. Why? Because white people will always say he was 5'7" and black. Even if it doesn't, it's not even close, right? So white people fill in fantasy for data all of the time. And so you shouldn't be making generalizations if you don't have historical or, sociological knowledge of the way that the structures work. And the structures are housing and education and taxation and policy, legislative, executive, or judicial. So those are places that you go to make the case for the things. The people who do this work for a living as academics, intellectuals, and policymakers read all of this data that then allow us to make those generalizations because it's aggregate data. So yes, don't make hasty generalizations, make informed ones.
In whiteness, it seems really common that we go from calling out, parenthetical, bigoted uncle or sibling moment, to arguing or confronting. Can we talk about setting boundaries?
That's a great question for the end of the talk. I think we should talk about boundaries. White people have messed up boundaries, man. They don't know who's in or out. They don't know what their own boundaries are. If I asked you all, if we were in a room together, which I would obviously prefer, and I had a whiteboard, which I also would obviously prefer, we would map out what are boundaries. What are acceptable boundaries? What are problematic boundaries? What are boundaries I've never considered? But the fact of the matter is that white people do not have boundaries, which is why they will reach out and grab somebody's hair and think that it's okay to touch them, right? In any way that's like not, so yes, we can talk about boundaries. And also we have to talk about intimacy. So I will sort of start ending this talk at the place where I began it, which is that intimacy is how you overcome the gap between the traumatizer and the traumatized, and the oppressor and the oppressed. And there's a bunch of literature about that. The starting place is Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. He was a Brazilian educator who wrote in the 60s and 70s, and he wrote a beautiful book about how do we teach anti-racism in colonial cultures, right? And intimacy is the space that you overcome that. But if you cannot be intimate with yourself, and you can't be honest and intimate with other people who are in your same in-group, you're going to be shit at doing it with other people who have different cultural opinions than you that you were unwilling to learn, right? It's the thing where white parents are like, I'm going to send my kid to Montessori so they learn Mandarin, but I don't want to live around black people. I want them to be cosmopolitan, but not black, right? And so white people make all these distinctions, right, that don't matter to justify their own insularity so that they don't have to feel feelings of discomfort or be called out. And I think, for those of us who do justice work, it's just so fucking disappointing to run into the white people who have structural power and they become very aggressive, right, when confronted instead of collaborative. But white people don't know how to collaborate. When were you taught to collaborate? Oh, I took a class on that. Oh, I think about that all the time. We've got a lot of sessions about that. I learned how to yield power and share power and share the microphone. And I willingly give up power so that other people can succeed. Like, white people suck at that, and that's why white supremacy exists. So if you're going to be in spaces where you're calling out and or calling people in to do, and this is a call-in situation, right? I'm calling you in to be an activist or an educator in some other way, then you have to be willing to do vulnerability. You have to be able to name your feelings. You have to set boundaries about what you're going to give and not give, who's in and who's out, who's transformable and who's not. And then you also have to manage all the feelings that come up with that, yours and theirs. So that's a set of skills to negotiate feelings that white people don't have, right? Because they retreat into their gated communities, they retreat into their institutions that are primarily white, and they return to their white family with 0 people of color or a token or two where they don't have to feel anything pushing them to grow. For my gender students I talk about, it's like, how many of your white parents have friends? When was the last time your dad made a friend? Zero. Donut. Zero. And then they all just laugh. And I'm like, does he have a man cave? Does he have a place that he hides out in and drinks by himself and numbs out because he hates this shit? Yes. Oh, yes. Right. Various versions of that. Does your mom have a hobby and a bunch of women that she bitches to constantly, like a sitcom? Yes, she does. They're all unhappy with the status quo. But what they're doing is reproducing white supremacy through the nuclear family. So those are the places where you have to, if you can't decolonize your household, you cannot decolonize America. So start at home and civilize yourselves. And yes, you should have boundaries, but that also means figuring out opportunities to grow and collaborate and to share power with people who you care about and whose opinions you care about and who you want to build with.
Okay, I'm gonna do one more because I think it's a good place to let off since we all are navigating this world largely digitally for the next who knows how long. What is the best way for us as white people to show allyship in the sort of digital verse on social media without engaging in performative allyship or virtue signaling?
I mean, okay, so I want to say again, because this is important, that the symbolic is the gateway to action. So, you know, performing allyship is actually important, and it's also important to fail at that so you can get better at it, okay? So there has to be accountability with the performative, but it has to go beyond just like, oh, I did the right thing, I put up the right Facebook picture, right? I mean, Facebook is not a place where you're changing minds. It's not a deliberative space where we're all in it together to build like the best America. We're not deliberating over shit. We're not. We are shouting at each other, or we're like-mindeding very much, right? So we are doing in-group solidarity really hard. It is not a transformative space. It's only transformative insofar as you are curating ideas that people are curious about and then giving them more when they're hungry. So you're feeding appetites at best, but it is not deliberative space. So you have to find spaces outside of that, which is why you have to leave your house. So this is the hard thing. The people of color know that staying in the house with the COVID is bad and is going to kill them anyway, right? So they are out marching. And my whole Facebook feed is, you know, white people concerned trolling the black folks, like, why don't they have masks? They do have masks, right? They understand the consequences. Survival actually is the thing of the day. But for white people, doing justice work is not a matter of survival. It's a matter of convenience, quite frankly, which is hence the hand-wringing and the neuroticism and the anxiety. And so, you know, if you want to move from performative allyship to real allyship, then you have to get outside of your house. So that is joining the organizations, that is divesting the monies, that's performing mutual aid, you know, that is showing up when you're called in by organizations. You are not going to be a very good ally if you're just like tethered to your computer and not thinking about other ways. Now, part of that, and I don't mean to be ableist about it, because I don't mean that you actually have to be in all of the spaces in person, right, to be there. But insofar as that's the thing that's being called to produce, then as an activist, and you can also be thinking about how can we make this space successful for different kinds of bodies, right, so that they can participate as well. But Facebook is not going to be the place where you convince your racist uncle to not vote for Trump. So that is a fool's errand, and you are welcome to bash the head into the wall. I just don't think it's the best use of time or attention. What is better is like, hey, y'all, right? Because ideally the people on your Facebook friends list are like intimates of yours. I read a thing. It made me feel a way. You might also like it. The end. You might get trolled, but you can manage it. Everybody here on the call can manage somebody being like, I didn't like that. That's your whole life, is like versus unlike. But insofar as it's a call in, then you are testifying to a positive feeling, right? Or a negative one that was productive, that is a call in for other people to feel with you in a way that's transformative. Do that. Be like, I did a thing, you might also like this. I saw a thing, you might also like this. Just recommending stuff to feed people's curiosity is so much more, it is more useful. I think it has a longer term effect than I changed my profile picture, which is, you know, it's not helpful, not as helpful. And that's the virtue signaling, right? Like, who are you signaling to? People of color, so you don't get called out? And like, when you change your profile picture, are you really talking to your racist uncle? No, you've already blocked him. You're not, that's not the thing for him. So think about who your audience is. Who are you talking to, and what are you trying to say to them or with them? And also, are you listening? Because white people do like to talk, and I am a talker, obviously. right? So I'm here for that. But there are spaces that call for talking, and there are spaces that call for listening. Be a better listener, right? I have not made this career by talking the entire time. I spent almost all of it listening. I talk almost exclusively to the white people, unless I'm called in to speak with people of color. So learn when it's time to listen and be a better listener, because all of the white people are talker people. Very few of them are listeners, right? Even if they are, they're just hearing and not actually processing. All right, what else do you got for me, Ron?
Do you want one more? I do have one more.
I'll do one more.
Okay. What do you think about the recent reaction to immediately firing people? Do you think that this is an appropriate response?
For cops? Yeah. I mean, listen, the cops are like the Catholic Church, and I say that as a lapsed Catholic. They just shuffle around asshole offenders and give them another job, right? So that's what happens. And so if you don't make it a publicity splash, then there's no reason that another, police department won't just fire these offenders. And so that's one reason why there's a conversation about having an offender database, because if you have 10 kills of unarmed Black people, that should be public searchable record. But a bunch of cop stuff is hidden, and there's no accountability or transparency because they've been shielded from liability for so long, because they've basically been an organizing ground for the Klan since the state police forces began, and certainly since they desegregated in the 70s. So a huge bulk of Klan organizing and white supremacist organizing starts with the cops. They actually organize it. And so there's no accountability or transparency for their excesses. So in the case of cops, yes, they should be fired. They should lose their income. But you also have to figure out a way to manage those people as part of society, right? We don't do it with prisoners, even though we should. And we have to figure out about cops too. Like, one way to do that is to send them to college instead of doing 10 weeks. Like in Arkansas, you have to do more credit hours to be a licensed hairstylist than to be a police officer, even though police officers can use lethal force. That's totally wrong. It's prima facie. It's obviously wrong. It should not happen. So there are ways to build accountability earlier so that the cops don't kill people. And, I mean, obviously I don't want any cops at all. So, but for that, you can't start there, right? We have to abolish them in the long term. But if you're going to do that, then you have to re-educate the entire culture. So if you want to start in institutions that can do that, higher ed can do that, K through 12 can do that, social work can do that, having access to healthcare can do that, right? There are lots of spaces where you can intervene so that people don't kill each other, and but you just shift all that burden to the cops, and then they kill people, right? Because then we've decided that they get to kill people so that we don't have to do it, because we're not going to take care of the social welfare of the country. So there are points of intervention that are multiple, right, based on, where people find themselves persuaded to intervene. But yes, you should fire those people, but you have to re-educate them, right? So killing should be a fireable offense, is what I'm saying.
Okay.
I know, right? But that was kind of an intense one to end on, but I feel pretty good about it.
I think that's actually a very good place to end. So I want to just make a couple notes at the end. First of all, Dr. Corrigan, thank you so much. This has been incredibly enlightening, and I'm sure everybody else, all 100 people, enjoyed it as much as I did. So thank you so much for giving us your time this evening. And I want to let everybody who's in the chat know that Arkansas Arts and Fashion Forum is going to continue trying to put together talks like this. We'd like to hear from you about what you want to talk about. So if you would email us if there's anything we didn't cover tonight that you would like to have covered, or something that's been nagging at you throughout this, this very trying time, email either Rachel, who's dropped her email in the chat, or myself, Robin, R-O-B-I-N, at arkansasfashion.org, and we can set up another event specifically for another topic. I'd love to bring Dr. Corrigan back, so come up with a good topic for her to talk about. We will let you guys know when we get that polished version of this up online.
Great. Thank you so much for hosting, Robin. Thank you all for doing the work and for showing up. And obviously, I'm all over the internet. Come find me. We'll keep talking. Stay well.
Bye. Good night, everybody.